Americans Remembered, interviewing on April the 17th, 2003, Betsy Heimke of Overland Park, Kansas, in her home in Overland Park, Kansas. Mrs. Heimke was born November 18th, 1929 in Baguio, the Philippines, and she and her family were captured and interned by the Japanese there for 3 years.
Yes.
Very interesting story, Betsy. You were born in the Philippines to American parents, is that correct?
That's correct.
And that was, so it's 12 years old when the Japanese invaded your home in the Philippines. Tell me about your family at that time. Who was your family and what were they doing there?
All right, in 1922, my mother and dad, Ethel and Eleanor Herold, went to the Philippines as school teachers. At that time, the Philippines was a commonwealth of the United States. The Bureau of Education was set up to teach the Philippines reading, writing, arithmetic, and how to use a washcloth. When they retired from teaching, my dad went to work for the Herold Lumber Company, a subsidiary of Ben Gitt Consolidated Mining Company. Dad set up an extensive sawmill logging operation, and with all the pine trees around Baguio, it was a thriving industry.
Was he retired at the time that...
I was born, yes.
I see.
Yes.
Go ahead.
And anyway, we were never told by the State Department to depart Baguio. We were told to stay put. The worst thing that Dad suspected was perhaps a 2-year blockade, and so he built 2 great big oil tanks so his lumber trucks would have enough fuel to go on. And so the Pearl Harbor was bombed to us in the Philippines because of the international dateline on the 8th of December. Dad and my older brother Billy, there's just us 2 kids in the family, got up for breakfast, heard that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. How dare anybody attack this United States of America, just like the World Trade Center? Well,
were you able to see at that time any potential repercussion for your own family?
We suspected that something would happen, but not what actually did happen. Anyway, Billy and I went to Brent School, the Episcopal boarding school. As a matter of fact, John Eisenhower was a junior at Brent when his dad was chief of staff for MacArthur. And being a church school, we always had chapel in the morning. We heard airplanes fly overhead. We cheered them, go bomb Tokyo off the face of the earth. The sun played a trick on us. We could not see the Japanese rotten fried egg that we call that under the planes. Later that morning, they came by, the planes flew by, and they bombed Camp John Hay, the military post a couple of miles off. Big, thick smoke, and we said, my gosh, those planes were Japanese planes.
And this was the day after Pearl Harbor?
This was on the 8th of December. And so Billy and I walked home. When we got home, our mother and the servants had gone nuts. A couple of bombs had fallen a couple of feet behind our house, shaking everything. And Mother was just going nuts. Didn't know what was going to happen.
How old was your brother at that time?
He was 14. Billy is his name. We're like 2 peas in the pod. Anyway, it was decided that Billy and I would go up to 67, as many kilometers north of Baguio, and stay with Mr. and Mrs. Kluge. Mr. Kluge was superintendent of Dad's sawmill up there. And so, being Christmas a couple of weeks off, I helped Mrs. Kluge make some honest Christmas cookies. Well, Mother didn't think she could stand Christmas without us kids, so she drove up to pick us up. And when we got back home, oh my goodness, our peaceful home was no longer very peaceful. We lived at the lumber yard. My dad could walk about 100 feet between our house and his office in the lumber yard. And he was never home. He was always at the office meeting with the former mayor of Baguio and other folks in town. Colonel Horan, the CEO at Camp John Hay, asked my dad and several other businessmen to kind of run the show, not knowing exactly what was going to happen. Strict blackout rules were imposed, and rationing started, and Don Bell, the radio announcer from Manila, announced that everything was fine, to stay in our homes, not to be worried. And Christmas came, and Mother had ordered a turkey from Australia by way of cold storage. During our Christmas dinner on Christmas noon, we were interrupted with so many air raids that I finally picked up Mother's pretty plate and took it to the air raid shelter to finish it. And I could see the Jap Zeros going up and down, just having more fun. It was almost like a movie. Well, we were told to stay in our home and to just kind of carry on, and the phone never stopped ringing. People were asking, what are you going to do and where are you going to go? Well, on the night of the 27th of December, 2 days after Christmas, amazingly, the phone stopped ringing. We went to bed, and in the middle of the night, knock, knock, knock on our door. My goodness, what is going to happen? We got up, we put on our bathrobes. Mother and Dad told Billy and me to stay in the back of our house. We could look down the hallway. Dad turned on the porch light, opened up the door, and about 30 Japanese soldiers entered our house. Oh, and did they look mean. Their beady little black eyes under their funny little black helmets. They looked so mean. Bayonets attached to their rifles. Their uniforms were filthy, muddy, wrinkled, dirty. They were muddy. They even looked like they had blood on them. Anyway, all these Jap soldiers came in the house. We were told not to escape, that we would be under guard, that in the morning there would be a meeting at Brent's school where we would all be registered. So we went back to bed, got up in the morning, had breakfast. Mother told Rita, our #1 cook, to fix us chicken a la king for lunch because we would be home for lunch. Well, we were driven to Brent by a Japanese soldier in our newly confiscated Studebaker. Last time we saw the car and our house, and got to Brent where we supposedly registered.
How far was Brent from your home, the school?
Oh, maybe about 2-3 miles. It wasn't that far. And that night we slept on the cold floor in our clothes.
Your whole family now?
The 4 of us. We ate some taffy candy, some raisins, and a little can of peaches that Mother just happened to have in her bag. The next morning, we were all ordered to walk to Camp John Hay. And at that time, our group was less than 500 people. The Caucasian population of Baguio was probably like a little American town. We had doctors, lawyers, merchants, chiefs, lots and lots of missionaries. The Peking language school from Peking, China had been evacuated to safe Baguio. So we had an influx of a lot of missionaries. Anyway, our whole group was ordered to walk from Brent to Camp John Hay. About 17 very pregnant women walked among us.
How many miles was that?
About 5 miles away. And we took turns carrying little babies, infants, too small to walk. Several Filipinos bravely lined the area where we were walking. And they looked at us, tears coming down their cheeks. Americanos, what will happen to you? And of course, we wondered ourselves what was going to happen to us. Well, we got to Camp John Hay, and they put all 500 of us into a 1-story wooden barracks made for about 40 soldiers. Not a stick of furniture.
Of the 500 people who were in the march, the five miles to the barracks, how many were Americans and how many were Caucasians, if you will? How many Filipinos?
Okay, we defined ourselves as ABCD, American, British, Dutch, and Chinese. We were mostly Americans. There were a lot of British, and there were a couple of Dutch and a couple of Chinese. But mostly we were Americans.
Would you take just a minute, please, and show us where Baguio is on the map? And then, since all of us have heard of Bataan and Corregidor, show us where in relationship to that, please.
All right. Will the light shine on this?
Sorry.
Okay. Here's a map of the Philippines. The largest island is Luzon. Here is Manila and Manila Bay. Hanging into Manila Bay is the Bataan Peninsula, and the island of Corregidor, or called the Rock, is in Manila Bay. Well, my hometown, Baguio, is about 150 miles north of Manila, a mile above sea level. Beautiful climate, lots of pine trees, No banana trees, no palm trees, because it was so cold.
Okay, good, thank you. So now you get to the barracks.
And the Japanese had bombed the barracks, so there were shrapnel holes in the roof. It rained. There were so many of us that the toilets plugged up. We had no food for the first 3 days.
Were you mistreated at all on the march or at any time prior to getting to the barracks?
No, no. What was so awful those first 3 days was the fact that it took a while before the adults really got their acts together that we were not going to go home. The Japanese lied to us. Had we known initially that we were going to be interned for 3 years, a little more organization would have been formed. And I also interject this fact: when the military POWs were captured, of course they didn't want to be captured in the first place, but the most senior officer always took command of the camp. We did not enjoy that prerogative, as it was. Anyway, the Japs chose my dad to be liaison officer of our camp because he had employed the largest number of Japanese soldiers, of Japanese carpenters before we were interned. And not only that, when the Japs were interned right after Pearl Harbor, my dad took it upon himself to exercise the Geneva Accords and feed these Japs. And so because of that, they were a little lenient and allowed Dad to be liaison, or whatever you want to call it. Anyway, Dad and some of the doctors and preachers organized the camp. It was very slow to get organized. The toilets plugged up. The former Mayor Halsema took a piece of broken galvanized iron roofing and started to dig a latrine in the backyard because the toilets had plugged up. And the first baby was born, and it was just perfectly chaos. Finally, we had several committees that were organized. Ray Hale drove an old beat-up truck to market every morning with a Jap guard, and he brought in produce that was swept off the market floor. Marie Halsema organized a vegetable crew, and these ladies in the dining room would separate that stuff to get food from it. We had a wood crew organized, and these guys went out and got pine trees, cut them up for firewood. Strong men volunteered to be cooks in the kitchen. And then there was a garbage crew. That was the best crew to be on. The guys went outside every morning. They tied 2 caissons together without the cannon and put a piece of wood on top, and they took the garbage out. And when they came back to camp, they always hoodwinked the Jap guards and went by one of the houses, the cottages, the barracks at Camp John Hay, and they looted as much as possible. The Japanese provided nothing, zero. Everything we had either was sent in to us by our friends, our servants, that was looted from wherever the garbage crew could loot from. Mattresses, pillowcases. As a matter of fact, I have a blouse. One day my mother was sent in a formal from one of her servants. Mother cut off the bottom of the formal and made me this blouse. And so this lasted me for 3 years. It's kind of beat up. And not only that, this was my Girl Scout skirt. It became my shorts because I had grown 7 inches during our internment. Well, slowly but surely things were organized. We were forbidden to have church, to have any kind of a meeting. However, as Easter approached, we were ordered to have a church service. And that was glorious. With all the missionaries in camp, we enjoyed singing those lovely hymns. And I, even as a little 12-year-old girl, prayed to God, "Dear God, I would like to go home and sleep in my nice little bed." Well, that didn't happen. So we did have church. Those first few weeks, Mother was terrified that I would be raped. So she made me stay in our little cubicle. And fortunately, Mrs. Stafford, she was the wife of a retired ophthalmologist, a Danish lady. She smuggled knitting needles into the camp. And I made this little outfit for Nancy doll. And at that time, we could get some stuff from the outside. This material came from the Easter School and Episcopal weaving establishment in Baguio. And so I knit this, just knowing how to add on and take off stitches, and of course Nancy survived the war.
On a daily basis, did you have any close supervision by the Japanese, or did they pretty much left you alone?
They pretty much left us alone per se, although when things kind of got organized, we had daily roll call, sometimes twice daily roll call. They made us line up and made sure everybody was there where they were supposed to be. After we had been interned maybe a month or so, it dawned on the adults and the teachers and our parents that we kids were missing out on school. Well, that was terrible. We had to get permission for school. And the Japanese said, "You Americans, you are so fussy. What do you need a school for? This war will last 100 years, and don't you know we will come out victorious?" Well, my goodness, I was a sixth grader, an innocent, pigtailed sixth grader. I finished the sixth grade, did all the seventh and eighth, and was a freshman in high school when school was terminated. Interestingly enough, the Japanese forbade the teaching of history and geography. Well, now history we could see, but geography, no one's going to change the mountains. Anyway, the teachers hoodwinked the Japanese, and they called history reading on our report cards. Getting supplies from the outside was kind of funny. One of Dad's friends, Herold native friends, a school teacher, knew that we needed books, so she went to Brent and she smuggled books into camp. Dad went down the hill and picked up these books that had come from either Brent's school or our house, and he brought them up to our barracks in a pillowcase. And so those were some of the books that we had.
Now, even though you were interned, were you reasonably free to come and go as long as you made roll call?
Yes, yes. Our school met in the large dining room at the large, long banquet-sized tables, kindergarten, first grade, down the line. The high school kids met outside on the porch. Paper was always a commodity. One day the Japs brought in a truckload of chits of every business in town, and we kids scrambled through the paper, turning it over, using the bare backside to write on. Pencils and pens were practically non-existent. Every Christmas I made my dad a calendar, and you can kind of figure out how many days in the month, and so that was always Dad's Christmas present.
How about food? Was it semi-starvation?
At first,
because of your Filipino friends, did you get food?
Yes. For a while, the food that Ray Hale brought in from the outside, the Japanese went around and they took money from us that was taken to the market to buy us food, which was contrary to the Geneva Accords. But then there was sufficient camp food for a while. And the fortunate part, the fact that my parents had lived in the Philippines for so many years, we had many friends and our servants who sent us as much food, clothing as possible. As a matter of fact, I will say at this time, that's one reason why after the war my parents went back to the Philippines to rebuild a lumber company, to repay the faithful Filipinos who did so much for us when we were interned. We know that some of those brave people were probably killed because of their guerrilla activity and how they tried so desperately hard to provide for us when we were locked up.
Did you see evidence of mistreatment of the native Filipino population, the Filipinos, by the Japanese?
No, but we have dear friends who were eyewitnesses to many of this, and we knew their families very, very well. Anyway, when we were still at Camp John Hay, one day we heard loud boom booms off in the distance. Oh, hot dogs, the Americans are going to come and we're going to get out of here. The next day the Japanese flaunted their newspapers and to show us that Bataan had fallen, and then a couple of weeks later Corregidor had fallen. Even at that time we had not the foggiest notion how long our internment was going to be. And then toward the end of April, the Japanese moved us to Camp Holmes. There was a couple of miles outside of Baguio, the former Philippine Constabulary Post, a huge parade ground carved out of a rather steep hillside. It was made up of 3 barracks, 2 two-story barracks and 1 single-story barracks. And at this point, I have to say that my dad, being liaison officer, the Japanese allowed Ethel and Eleanor, my parents, to share the same bed. Now, they separated all the other men and women, and this, of course, aggravated a lot of people. But having been raised by a Victorian mother, even as a 12-year-old, I really was not aware of the birds and the bees. So I just thought it was natural for Mother and Dad to share the same bed. And so eventually, you know, it kind of dawned on me, and Mother was not going to deny the fact that she and Dad shared the same bunk. Anyway, the Japanese completely severed men and women from sleeping together.
Did you have adequate living space?
Not really.
I don't mean great
always,
space, but adequate?
No, we were always very crowded. Billy stayed in the 2-story men's barracks, Mother, Dad, and I in the middle barracks, always at a corner area, so the Japanese could holler up to Mr. Herold, and they would bark off orders to him. When you see Japanese soldier, you bow. You bow. Respectful Japanese officer. One more thing. You never call Japanese Jap. Very bad. You always call it Japanese. And third law, never escape. If you escape, you be shot. Well, in the 1-story barracks, at the end of the parade ground, that was the women's barracks. Down the hillside was a large court bisected by a sidewalk. We kids played volleyball on the one side. There were a couple of tiny huts on the other side where the Maryknoll and Episcopal sisters lived. At the end of the sidewalk, at the edge of the camp where the mountain trail curved around, was a 2-story commanding officer's house. That became the hospital where the doctors and nurses pretty well lived. Unbeknownst to me at that time, Dr. Manalo, the Ben-Get doctor, smuggled a radio into camp, and Phil Markert, an electrical engineer, put that radio together. So a precious few people could hear of the advancement across the Pacific. Phyllis Gibbons, my 3rd grade Brent teacher, volunteered to do the laundry. God bless her. And after we were liberated, MacArthur sought her out, and she was Arthur MacArthur's 3rd grade tutor in Tokyo in the MacArthur compound. Adjacent to the hospital was a little cottage, and that became the baby house, where all the 17 mamas and the babies lived. And then at the driveway, at the top of the driveway into camp, was the guardhouse, a kind of a 1-story structure where the guards lived. Every morning they got up and did their noisy calisthenics and all that nonsense. And then on the parade ground is where we had our daily roll call to make sure everybody was there. Fabian Ream was a very ingenious fellow. He had a little kind of a workshop where he made false teeth out of a can, and he made all sorts of other things out of practically nothing. We saved everything. I think we were the original recyclers. What the wood crew didn't bring in, we just found here and there. We traded here and there. A tin can was never tossed out. A glass jar with a lid. One day the garbage crew brought in a whole bunch of curtains that was cut up and made into all sorts of garments. After the war, when Mother and I saw the movie, The Sound of Music, we laughed and cried as Maria tore off those drapes from the palace to make the kids those clothes, because that's exactly what we did. When we were at Camp Holmes, we had school, we had plays, we had a wonderful chorus in our camp. Marvin Dirks had been chosen to be Nelson Eddy's understudy, and Mary Dyer had a seat on the Metropolitan Opera. They chose to be missionaries instead, and so those folks were in our camp, and what with all the other missionaries, we had a super choir. My mother had a trained soprano voice. She was also on this choir, and I guess of the fact that Mother was on the choir, Marvin allowed Billy and me to also be on the choir, and we kids really enjoyed that. That's where I learned how to read sheet music.
Not including the 17 babies. How many youngsters, let's say 15 and under, were there?
Yes.
In that group?
Well,
in your group?
I have statistics here and there of how many we all were. There were approximately 37 students and 35 teachers. And so our education really did not suffer as much as one would suppose. As a matter of fact, I learned way back then that if a teacher has on her head, his head, that knowledge, they can impart that to students very, very well. Anyway, our sojourn at Camp Holmes was 2 years and 8 months. I had my 13th, 14th, 15th birthday there. Christmases initially were rather joyful. The Japanese allowed a little more food, a little more of the servants to send in to us. And of course we made stuff out of just practically nothing. I made my mother...
Did the Japanese ever send in food and so on, or they just allowed you to get it?
Once in a while the Japanese seemed to have candy that they gave to the kids. I made this little glass case for my mother when we were locked up, and of course this survived the war. It took about 2 years for our relatives back in the States to learn through the Red Cross that we were alive, that we were prisoners of war. And this, of course, was such a worry to my parents. Being such a little girl, I don't think the impact of our internment really hit me until perhaps I had been interned for about a year or so. Then it kind of dawned on me, you know, this wasn't so really neat. War is hell. It's terrible. Were we even going to get out of this alive? Here my dad and the other adults were losing 4 years of their most favorable employment. And the worry that they had was really monumental.
How old were your parents at that time, do you remember?
Well, they were in their low 40s, 41, 45-ish, and terribly concerned. My mother was one of these ladies, these gung-ho super ladies. She was asked to be in charge of the women in the camp by Carl Eschbach, one of the preachers, and she said, "Oh, Carl, I can't possibly do that because I'm so busy helping Elmer." "Well, Ethel," he said, "if you are a patriot, you will do something for your country, and you will kind of run the women's committee," which my mother did. And I know she stepped on some toes, but she was just a lady who really didn't care. A little organization had to be established. Cleanliness, a little organization was so important, and so she was in that function for a while.
Did you have church services every Sunday?
Yes, we did. And what with the missionaries in camp, we kind of had a
Bible studies?
Oh yes, a lot of Bible studies. The missionaries, they taught Chinese, they taught Japanese. Some of the adults had adult classes for the foreign languages. By and large, it was interesting that a large number in our camp had a college education, so the level of knowledge of the adults was I think, very, very unusual. We put on the play Our Town, we put on the Messiah a couple of times, and so living in Camp Holmes was very interesting. Rufus Gray was an innocent missionary that happened to have a camera when we were interned. The Japanese thought he was a spy. They took him out and they murdered him. His wife was pregnant with Billy Gray. He was born in the camp. Herbie Swick and Richie Green were a couple of mining engineers. Herbie had taken out a commission to be in the military before the war. The Japanese found that out. They took Herbie out several times, and they almost tortured him to death. Why he was put back into our civilian camp, we could never figure out, but they did. And Herbie didn't think he could put up with another torture session, so he teamed up with Richie Green, and those two guys successfully escaped. Wow, the morale skyrocketed. Well, unfortunately, after that time, the Japanese stopped a lot of food from coming into the camp, and unfortunately they took out their 3 bunkmates, Jimmy Halsema, Bill Mowell, and G. Kneebone, and they almost tortured them to death. They were taken out to the Jap Caputi, that's like the German Gestapo, and they just really tortured them. They tied their thumbs behind their backs, hoisted them off the floor, and Bill Mal was just recovering from polio. He could hardly walk. As a matter of fact, Jimmy was my teacher in camp, and when he sat across a table from me, his thumbs looked like they were going to pop off. Well, a strong body has wonderful ways of healing, and Jimmy was our house guest here a couple of years ago, and Jimmy's thumbs look good. As a matter of fact, Jimmy Helsima is our kind of self-appointed camp historian, and he's a great guy and lives on a farm in Pennsylvania as we speak. Toward the end of December in 1944, after we had been locked up almost 3 years, we saw little planes down at Lingayen. Hot dogs, the Americans are coming back. They were bombing Shell standard petroleum tanks down there. On the 28th of December 1944, exactly 3 years to the day of our incarceration, the Japanese said, "You move." We piled into open Japanese army trucks, departed Camp Holmes, went down the Degillion Road to the lowlands. The truck suddenly
Would that have been south?
Yes, south of Baguio, on the way to Manila. The Japanese guards had to go to the bathroom. Everybody else did too, so we climbed out of the trucks, found a pink bush or a blue bush, went to the bathroom, climbed back in the trucks, went to the little town of Binalonan, were all ordered out of the trucks and sat in the hot noonday sun for several hours. The camp had a skinny cow that was butchered before we left Camp Holmes, and without refrigeration, that meat made me sicker than a dog. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, no place to go to the bathroom. Mother found a pile of ashes that was used as our outdoor toilet. Some ladies had sheets, blankets that made a kind of a shield so we could have a little privacy. By late afternoon, half as many trucks came to pick us up, and they took us to Manila. By the time we got going, we were probably about 40 in a truck. I sat on my dad's lap, put my head on my mother's lap, and the truck bounced along. Billy and a Jap guard stood leaning over the cab. The Jap guard had his bayonet, and we hoped that Billy or the guard would fall onto that bayonet and get cut. Well, as we approached Manila, we thought we were going to be put into Santa Tomas internment camp, but we entered Bilibid prison, actually Bilibid Penitentiary, that had been built by the Spaniards in 1908. It had been condemned for human habitation before the war. All electrical and plumbing had been removed. Actually, it was a dungeon. The top floor had been removed, and so actually it was only a 2-story structure. At that time, the Japs allowed families to stay together. So the 4 of us were in this little corner building behind this mango tree. We could look out onto the wall, onto Quezon Boulevard. Bilibid in Filipino means a wheel, and you can see it is a wheel. This was the compound, the so-called hospital compound in the northern part of Bilibid, and this is Quezon Boulevard, and this is the Far Eastern University, the Pasig River in Manila Bay. Bilibid had formerly been occupied by military POWs, and those guys had been moved to the compound adjacent to us. And when the military POWs were in Bilibid, God bless them, they had erected a latrine, a 20-foot slanted trough with bits and pieces of galvanized iron tin. At the high side was a severed petroleum tank filled with water. When it was full, it flushed the trough into this gurgling manhole full of flies. And oh my, when we were in Bilibid, B-24s bombed Manila every day. It was wonderful to see those glorious American planes bombed. We got out there and we would excitedly count how many planes there were. One day we saw one of the planes get shot down that was just devastating. Toward the end of internment, I think that we perhaps no more than 600 or 800 calories a day. For breakfast, we probably got a slice of baked cornmeal mush filled with little black weevils, our source of protein, and maybe a half a cup of submarine coffee. The grounds were boiled and boiled and boiled until it looked like tea. And if the coffee grounds were not enough, toasted peanut shells were used. No lunch. For supper, we probably had about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, maybe a tablespoon of cooked camotes, that's like a yam, maybe a little bit of onion, maybe a square of cooked camote, and also this white, bitter-tasting, weird stuff. The Japanese had beans of some sort. They ground up the beans, mixed it with hot water, squeezed it, and got some nourishment, and they tossed out this white bean curd that we ate. It was Japanese garbage, but we ate it for food. We got only one Red Cross shipment the whole time we were locked up. Not only food, but some clothing, medical supplies. It really saved our lives. Anyway, Mother was very scotchy with our food. She saved it, religiously saved it. And so we were fortunate, the fact that Mother had saved our allotment of food. Some people foolishly gobble theirs up, and because of not being used to that food, they barfed it up. So we were supplemented with the food that Mother had saved.
In Bilibid, you joined your group of 500 approximately.
Yes.
Joined with other Caucasians that were imprisoned?
This was simply our own original Baguio Brent School Camp Homes group. We had people, during the camp that came in that were allowed to go out, but essentially our group remained the same. And so it was on the night, Saturday night, the 3rd of February. We had just finished roll call, and the 4 of us had gone up to our bunks to visit, to talk. We never had lights at Bilibid at night, and so we visited, we talked, and what did we talk about? Food, because we were so hungry. We shared recipes and all that sort of thing. Well, as it started to get dark from the north, we heard this rumbling sound that got louder and louder. We looked out of our window onto Quezon Boulevard, where we could see native Filipinos dashing in and out of their buildings, and this noise got louder and louder. Suddenly there appeared one tank, and a second tank, and a third tank, and the tank stopped. And the Japanese from the Far Eastern University opened fire on the tanks. Bright red, orange, yellow streaks at the tanks. The tank shot back, more bright streaks. The tanks bounced like a big rubber ball. My first lesson in Physics 101. Then it dawned on us, my God, the Americans had come. Well, the Battle of Manila then started and really lasted for the next 6 weeks. The last week, watching Baghdad reminded me of the battle and the flashes and all that sort of thing. Well, we were all ordered downstairs in the barracks. Billy and I knew that Mother had saved a bunch of peanuts among our junk, so Billy and I snuck upstairs, and when we got to our cubicle, we looked outside, and my God, there were 8 Sherman tanks, all facing their guns toward Bilibid. The Japs had gone on the roof and were tossing off Molotov cocktails at the tanks. One of the tanks did get blown up. Well, in the morning, by daybreak, we were all allowed to go up to our cubicles. On Quezon Boulevard was a very dead Jap soldier. The Filipinos ran up to him, stripped him of his clothes, grabbed his rifle, kicked him in the head, saluted him, and ran off. We thought that was kind of funny. Well, at 9 o'clock on the 4th of February, it was announced that we would all be meeting downstairs in the building, and a big announcement was going to be made. And the announcement was from the Japanese and the commandant in charge of the POWs next to us and our own group, that we would be not under the Japanese jurisdiction anymore. The Japanese guards were called from the roof where they had been shooting all night, and we all gathered, all 500 of us squished into the downstairs of the barracks. And when the Japanese clomped down the stairs in their heavy boots, we made a path for them, and we told everybody and the little kids, don't you let out a peep. And the Jap guards departed, and as they departed, we were free. And it was just glorious. My very patriotic mother had made an American flag out of scraps of material. And that flag, pieces of that flag, I made my own flag. And that hangs on the wall behind me. Well, we all sang the Star-Spangled Banner and God Save the King. And it was just glorious because we were free. Well, we were still behind these 30-foot walls in Bilibid. All the shooting was going on. No one had a car, keys to the car, gas for a car. So we were all just wondering what was going to happen. But we were free. So we indulged ourselves and finished our Red Cross food. If it made us sick, that was just too bad. Well, that night, just miraculously, the 37th Infantry Division literally stumbled onto our camp. Why the military, we did not know. We had been in Bilibid during the whole war. I will never to this day figure out. But anyway, we were literally stumbled onto. We heard loud shouts down at the back gate and went downstairs. And when we saw these beautiful, glorious American GIs, they were just heaven. They wore these weird helmets that we had never seen. And they were just a bunch of kids. They offered us cigarettes and chewing gum and a candy bar. A hand grenade or a handful of bullets. Kind of reminds me of the GIs as we speak in Baghdad. Anyway, that night, that next night, the 5th of February, the GIs came in and they said, okay guys, the Japs are going to blow up the place, because at that time we went out on the balcony and Manila was aflame from east to west as the wind from Manila Bay blew toward us. Those flames got closer and closer, and we could see these 6-8-story buildings leap in the air and crash. No TV movie could ever show that. Anyway, we were rounded up to evacuate. There were 456 of us civilians and 811 military POWs adjacent to us. We were all safely evacuated from Bilibid about 7 miles north to Angtibai, an old shoe factory. Billy walked with some of his friends. Mother and Dad and I rode in the back of a Jeep, machine gun, passenger front seat, and the 3 of us in the back seat. We roared north about 3 blocks. A GI with a walkie-talkie jumped in the middle of the road. You go east 2 blocks. So we went east 2 blocks. Then another GI jumped in the middle of the road. Anyway, that's how we ziggied out to Angtibai, this old shoe factory. And when we got out there, it was like a carnival. It was like homecoming. We were absolutely intoxicated with this freedom phenomena. And those blessed GIs, they set up a field kitchen outside. There were perhaps a dozen or so bare 100-watt bulbs in this kind of garden-like area, and they set up a field kitchen. We had dehydrated scrambled eggs, real coffee, white sugar, canned milk, eating out of canteens, and it was just wonderful. And another thing that I'll just never forget, there was a big army truck with a canvas over it filled with little radios, blinking red lights. Those guys were communicating with people all over the world, and there was a PA system and this wonderful music blared out. Whatever the music was, I haven't the foggiest recollection. However, the music stopped, and this American got on the radio. He said, "We now interrupt this program, ladies and gentlemen, to bring you the latest news." Ho ho, we said, the honest news for 3 years. And this guy continued, on the European front, the Americans are about 40 miles from Berlin. Oh, that's wonderful. And he continued, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have just been handed this dispatch. Several thousand American and British civilian prisoners of war had just been liberated from camps in Manila." Well, we pinched each other. "That's us, you guys." And then this guy concluded, he said, "Now I sign off, ladies and gentlemen. This is San Francisco, the United States of America." Well, we all just grasped each other and hugged each other. We are free. We are free. We are really free. Well, by late afternoon, we could see where the Japanese had found where we were, and they started to shoot at us. And so the GI said, "Okay, guys, they found out where you are." So this time we climbed into American trucks, were taken back to Bilibid. In the meantime, the Filipinos had looted Bilibid, just like the looting of the museum in Baghdad. Unfortunately, my mother's flag was lost during all that stuff. Anyway, we stayed in Bilibid for about the next month or so. During literally the Battle of Manila, the GI set up a battery of trench mortars behind us. I've got the picture here someplace. Oh, where's that picture? There is Bilibid in the background, and here are the row of trench mortars, and they shot the mortars over our heads. We got medical attention, we got food. It was just glorious. We got Red Cross mail from the States. Here's a picture of a bunch of us all standing in line. Here I am in that same outfit that I showed you earlier. I have identified all these people. You can see the wall of Bilibid in one of the turrets. Slowly but surely, we all were evacuated back to the States. The military POWs, the elderly, the sick, they of course went first. There was an opening for 6 single men. Father Mandel, a bachelor Episcopal priest, volunteered to chaperone 5 single men, boys actually, one of whom was my brother. Billy said, "Mom, some of these GIs, you're younger than I am. Here I am, the ripe old age of 17, and so Mother allowed Billy to go with these guys. Most of us were flown in a C-47 cargo plane to the island of Leyte, and the men were stationed in a men's camp at Tacloban. We ladies were put at the first convalescent right directly on the beach, occupying big army tents. We had the convenience, the joy of eating cafeteria style with hundreds and hundreds of convalescing soldiers.
What was the date of your liberation specifically?
4 February. And so by the time we got down to Leyte, it was sometime in April. I'm not just sure exactly the date. I've got that in my scrapbook. Anyway, we were on Leyte for probably about a month, and talking to these GIs was so glorious because they filled us in on what happened the previous 3 years. We were always curious as to who the president was. We assumed it was Roosevelt. Well, question number 2, who is his vice president? And whatever the GIs told us, we thought was true. And their answer was, a crooked little haberdasher from Independence, Missouri. Well, living in Overland Park, not too far from Independence, I kind of feel bad to say that story, but you know, rumors will be rumors, and I just think it's interesting. I think Truman did the right thing to have dropped the atom bomb, because, well, that's a whole different story. But anyway, the 3 of us finally got transportation on a Dutch freighter, the Japara, that had been commandeered by the United States Navy. We boarded the ship. The men were put in a rear hold, we ladies in a forward hold, and departed Leyte. When we first got to Leyte, the island of Leyte and Samar make a bay, and there were so many boats in the bay that you couldn't even see the shoreline across. One morning we got up, and my gosh, most of those boats have gone. We learned that loose lips sink ships. All those ships had gone north for the invasion of Japan. At that time, Iwo Jima was being fought for. Anyway, our little Japara was in a huge convoy when we departed, lady. So many boats in our convoy, you couldn't even see the shore. Every day there were fewer and fewer boats. By the time we got to San Francisco, we were the only boat. And strict rules on the boat. You never tossed anything out until sunset. And we were ordered to keep our life preservers with us all the time. You sleep on it, you sit on it. You never leave it out of your sight. Well, as we approached San Francisco Bay, it was, I want to say, a Hollywood picture-perfect day. The ocean was like glass. We could see that beautiful Golden Gate. The sun was coming up over the mountains. And my teenagers, friends and I thought, hey, we can swim ashore. Let's toss our life preservers overboard, which we did. And they sank. Well, my gosh, teenagers will be goofy teenagers. And we thought, hey, let's not tell anybody. Well, the boat docked at one of the docks on the bay. There was an army band playing for us as we disembarked. We had a dear friend, Ann Clement, that had become a wave that met us. And it was just so absolutely glorious to see these big buildings with glass in the windows. The buildings had a square corner. They weren't all shot to heck. And we stayed at the Fairmont Hotel, and the food was glorious. And it was just too good to be true that we were free.
How much sooner had Billy gotten home than you, and was he waiting there when you disembarked?
No, Billy had gone to the States several weeks before we did. He went to Missoula, Montana, and stayed with an aunt and uncle, and graduated from high school that spring. And so after the three of us landed in Frisco, we stayed with friends and relatives and met Billy that same year in Missoula. And then, then late in 1945, Dad was given special permission by the Army to go back to Baguio and rebuild his lumber company, because he was so indebted to the Filipinos for what they had done to us and for us during our incarceration. And it is so ironic, the fact that Dad was with a lumber company. Everybody's house had either been bombed or burned. Even our own house had been burned. This was our house before the war, and this was our house after the war. It was a chimney. And this is a view of Mother and Dad taken in the ruined downtown Escolta, Manila, in the background. Dad is wearing a uniform, as I call it, his cut-off khaki pants. The bottoms became rags or potholders. Mother is wearing a Puritan cape that she made me before the war for a costume party. It was smuggled into camp with our food, and she made it into a dress. And so anyway, Mother went back to the Philippines in 1946. Billy and I stayed in the States to finish school. I graduated from a girls' boarding school, Kemper Hall in Kenosha, Wisconsin, after which I went to Northwestern, where I got my nurse's training. And 50 years ago, last year, I was married to my wonderful friend, and about 6 years ago, I retired from the emergency room at Shawnee Mission Hospital, where I worked for about 25 and a half years. We have 4 grown kids and 5 grandchildren.
Tell me about your children and your grandchildren. Where are they and what are their names?
Susan Elizabeth Thompson is an occupational therapist. She lives in Tonganoxie with Mandy, her dog, and her husband, Corey. Bill is our mechanical engineer, our bachelor son that lives with us. He works over in Independence. He's a mechanical engineer. Bob is a geophysicist for Texaco, now Chef Tex. He's married to Julie. They have Carl and Kristen. They live in Midland, Texas. Sally, our baby, is a first grade teacher at Heatherstone Grade School in Olathe. She's married to Tom Karst. Tom's dad was MIA, KIA in the Vietnam War. Tom and Sally have Ben, Brian, and Betsy. Ben, Brian, and Betsy. Ben is a freshman at K-State. Brian is a junior at Olathe East, and Betsy's a 7th grader.
How about Billy?
My brother, Billy, and Joanne live in Sylacauga, Alabama. And within the month, Billy and I will be attending a 37th Infantry reunion in Corpus Christi, Texas. These guys and us guys kind of get together infrequently for these wonderful reunions where we all laugh and cry and compare notes and all that sort of thing.
How about Mom and Dad? They both went back to the Philippines.
Yes.
Did they both die over there?
No,
Are they still living?
No, Dad retired, a long time ago, in about 1959. They came back to Wisconsin and very happily lived on their farm outside of the little town of Potosi, Wisconsin. They died and are buried in Potosi as we speak.
So they were originally from Wisconsin?
Yes. My mother originally from Potosi, Wisconsin. My dad from Bridgeport, Wisconsin. They met at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, where they were both going to school. My dad was in France during the First World War as a tank lieutenant.
That is a great story. Carries a lot of memories for you, I know. Even now, we're engaged in a conflict of war in Iraq. It's almost 60 years ago that you were interned by the Japanese. Do you have any final thoughts about being a citizen of the United States or fulfilling one's duty or any patriotic statement of any kind?
I think it's interesting that after the war, when I came back to the States, being a teenager and being in these classes with other teenagers, you try so desperately to meld with those other teenagers. And so you just try to be cool, you know. And when I would relate some crazy, weird, maybe not necessarily terrible thing about our internment, my classmates would look at me as though I were weird, as though I were telling a lie, like I was telling a far-fetched story. And this I have shared with other of my teenage POW buddies, how we were not necessarily castigated, but they just didn't want us to talk about it. So for 50 years almost, I never did talk about it. And interestingly enough, we met a lady that had been a high school English teacher, and she said, "Betsy, I could choke your English teacher from high school for not having you sit down and write your experiences." So through the years, I have kind of written bits and pieces of stuff. As a matter of fact, I have written a few things, and if I could find a good editor, I would happily put this and some of these pictures and things together to make a story. When we were evacuated from Bilibid, the GIs said to take with us what we could. And this was my suitcase, Baguio Country Club chair cover. I had my doll in it and a handful of homemade, handmade greeting cards, report cards, my doll, of course, and my flag. And so this was my suitcase.
From the country club in Baguio?
Yes.
Well, Betsy, that is a great story. Thank you so much for the time that you've given to tell us about it.
Thank you so much. And I always have to say, I would not be sitting here as a free American enjoying our joyous free country were it not for the 37th Division. God bless those guys. They did their duty to honor country, or I would not be here today. Thank you, and God bless America.
Amen.